This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the May 9th edition of the DRF Players Podcast, show 236, the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks recap show with lots of listener feedback and questions. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornital, back with you for the next hour. I am in the Brooklyn bunker today. There was a rumor I was going to be at the DRF offices in New York, and I was sort of missing using the phrase, the DRF offices in New York. But I just have to sneak it in because I am, in fact, here in the bunker with Muggs, the handicapping Labrador. We are joined from Planet Texas by a man who must be hungover, both literally and figuratively. He is the people's champion, Jonathan Kinchin. JK, what's up?
Man, I'm telling you, it's a real thing, Derby hangover. And it's not just like physically, like because you had too many mint juleps, but like it's kind of a sad day the day after because like you've had this build up all year long for like 364 days, 363, I guess if you count Oaks, like waiting for this race, and then when it's over, it's like, oh, what am I going to do next weekend? Bet the Bogey? I mean, like what? I mean, which is fine, right? I mean,
don't be knocking the Bogey, man. That's a historic race.
It seems to be coming like it's going to turn out to be a good race, but I'm always the flight home. I'm always a little bit depressed after Derby, but
it's tough.
Nonetheless,
it's tough.
2 weeks we'll be ready for the Preakness.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I get it, believe me, but we've got the Preakness. We got the whole Triple Crown Trail to look forward to here. The summer meets, Saratoga and Del Mar, and then the run up to the Breeders' Cup. I feel like the day after the Breeders' Cup is the one where I get a little weepy personally, but I get it. It's one of the reasons Susan and I went every year from 98 to 2003. That's right. And the reason we stopped doing it as the annual thing on our calendar was we decided it was the kind of vacation after which you needed a vacation. And we loved it. Don't get me wrong. But it just became like a little too tough to sort of be like deadheaded for the entire following week. And you're right. It's not just the booze. It's the excitement. It's the anticipation. It's all that stuff tangled together. Let me ask, how did your experience at this year's Derby sort of rank with all the various years? What is it now, 9 in a row you've gone to or something crazy?
Yeah, it's 9. I only missed one Kentucky Oaks, and that was in the middle of my high school football coaching career. We had a spring game the night that Blind Luck won the Kentucky Oaks. So that's the only Oaks I've missed in that 9-year span. But look, it was fun. It's always a little bit better when it doesn't rain. But once you get there and you start actually participating, the rain doesn't really get to you much. It's just, I guess you sometimes wish that you didn't have to answer the questions about soft ground or answer the questions about will they or will they not like the surface and so on and so forth. But it's part of the handicapping puzzle we've all fallen in love with. So it was good. It ranks up there. I had a good time, a good group of people that I hung out with. So that made it a lot of fun. We took this is the first time we actually stayed in Lexington and took a van over. A friend of mine, Jake Ballas, was running a horse Burn a Diva on Friday. And so Jake has been living in Lexington for a while, knows some of the college kids from his brother going to school at UK. And so he paid a college kid $600. We rented a van for $300, and he was our driver for 2 days and drove us back and forth for a total of $1,000 between 10 people. It worked out pretty good.
Wow, that is a steal at twice the price. Another good wise guy tip amongst your many. You made me look pretty smart at a Derby party on Saturday. I was sitting there, and this doesn't even have anything to do with Divisadero or Limousine Liberal. We were sitting there on the roof at my friend's place in the South Slope between, the 90 minutes between races on the undercard, and somebody was talking about cocktails at the Kentucky Derby and mentioned the Lily. And my friends who were hosting the party, both native Louisvillians, but who've lived in New York for at least a decade, were like, there's no Lily. There's no Lily. It's the mint julep is the drink. And I was able to say, actually, my friend Jonathan is a big fan of the pink lilies that they drink on Oaks Day. And I Googled it and gave them the recipe and everything. And I was able to feel, like Mr. Kentucky Derby expert there, thanks to you. How many lilies did you consume?
Wow. In 2 days?
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't say. It was look, when they start coming by and you kind of find a spot to watch the big races and you got the big lead up going into the race, you can't really leave to go to the line to get the drink you really want. They walk by with juleps and lilies, and if they're out of juleps, you got to grab a lily. If they're out of juleps, or lilies, you got to grab a julep. So you just take what you can get. So I'll plead the fifth on how many I have.
I like it. My same friends also confirmed how big of a thing Thurby is. Their friends who still live in Louisville neglected to go to the Oaks or Derby, but did get there for Thurby. It's definitely like it's the new local day. The marketing is true. So I thought that was an interesting aspect as well. All right, enough of our yakking. Let's get down to business here and talk about this Kentucky Derby. Always Dreaming confirmed the promise he showed, confounded some of the experts who questioned him based on the previous speed figures, etc., the Pletcher stat, etc. What did you think of Always Dreaming's performance, and what did it mean for you personally?
You mean my first pick in the Derby draft?
I left that softball right up there for you to spike in my face. I was torn between Irish War Cry. I think I went first and I went ahead, took War Cry. You got Always Dreaming, and you have a commanding lead in our little Derby draft.
No, I think he ran really well. It was good for Todd, and I tell you, one of my favorite videos I've seen the entire weekend on Twitter is the video of Angel Cordero and Todd hugging in the path, walking back to the paddock, and Angel being in tears, and how much that relationship has meant to all three of those guys, Johnny, Angel, and Todd. And I've been able. Jake Ballas has a good relationship with Cordero, and so Friday night we were actually at the same place for dinner where he was, and I looked across the table and I said, "Are you excited for tomorrow? Do you think Always Dreaming is going to relax?" And he got I've seen him a bunch of times. He got really nervous and didn't want to talk about it. He's like, "Wow, it just makes me really nervous." And I know how badly he wanted to win a Derby for Todd, and obviously it's not always about just the connections. The horse did his job as well, but that's a special part of that story that kind of touches my heart the most, that I think of any of the stories we heard this weekend.
Let's explain a little more for some of the newer listeners who maybe listened to us last week for Derby and stuck around. Cordero, of course, the jockey agent for John Velasquez. The two have been working together since, I guess, the mid-'90s, since I came into the game. And, of course, they've always had a special relationship with the Pletcher barn, riding first call for so many of the great Pletcher horses. Now, in intervening years, of course, famously, Pletcher got his Derby with Super Saver in whatever that was, 2009. And Johnny got his Derby in that little bit of drama when Robbie Alvarado got hurt, and he ended up, Angel ends up getting him on Animal Kingdom at the 11th hour, and they got that Derby back in, I'm just guessing years here, 2011. It's all a blur. So they'd each won it, but not together. And it definitely felt, I think, for each of them like a hole on their resume. And then how about just Pletcher in general to get this victory with such a display of horsemanship, to have to call an audible the way he did with the way the horse was training. For folks who missed that story somehow, Always Dreaming very keen in the weeks leading up to the race, basically kicking the barn door down, wanting to run, wishing his race was Tuesday, needing to wait till Saturday. What will happen sometimes to horses in that state is they get over the top. They leave too much in their training. Race day comes, they sort of bounce, if you will, almost off their training. They've expended their energy in an inefficient way. So Pletcher calls the audible. He changes exercise riders, goes to the draw reins to try to get the horse under control. It works like a charm. And this guy who had been questioned, the 1 for 45 stat, had been questioned whether or not he had what it took to be a Derby winning trainer multiple times, shows that, in fact, he does have that, and does it in such style, having to make such a difficult training call that really speaks to his horsemanship and everything he learned from his father and from D. Wayne Lucas and all his years around the racetrack. Pretty cool story in every respect.
No, absolutely. And I think, people will talk about the 2 for 48 stat. And I think that when stats, we talk about good stat, bad stat all the time. I mean, I think that's a bad stat. I think the good stat that I think carries more weight is he's won the Kentucky Derby 2 times since 2009. And you know, I think that if you go back into your career or whatever it is, if you're listening, if you're a banker, I mean, think about how many things you've learned in your career over the time that you've been doing your craft. And Todd, you know, he got started at a young age, and obviously, and it's argued that half of those horses probably had no business being in the Derby anyways, and that he ran and he got them there because of how good of a horseman he is, and the program that they run, and getting graded stakes into these 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and getting them ready for the big stage. So, you know, I think it's an unfair stat to kind of criticize him about. And I think I view Todd more as a 2 Derbies since 2009 guy rather than a 2 Derbies and 48 tries.
Now, there's the idea also that we've talked about on the show so many times. A lot of our listeners get a kick out of this because I think it has so much truth in it. The whole concept of the owner-picked spot. And I heard several sharp observers, including Jay Privman, Mike Watchmaker, make this assessment in the week leading up to the race. You know, what's his record? That's his record. But what's his record with the horses he wanted to run? And it brings back that fantasy scenario to me of I wish when a trainer made an entry in a race, there was a little box they could check that said owner picked the spot. So we as handicappers could see that and adjust accordingly. With the Pletcher non-owner picked spot horses in the Kentucky Derby, what would his record look like? Probably more like 2 for 19 with 3 seconds and 3/3 or whatever it is. So it's another thing that you have to consider when you're evaluating this. All right, let's talk about the performance itself now. Putting all the human stuff aside, you know, you were obviously a fan of this horse. You weren't concerned by some of the things that many players were worried about with Always Dreaming. Did this exceed your expectation? Did it meet your expectations? Did it exceed your expectations? And the big question, what do we think of his chances in 2 weeks in Baltimore?
Well, I guess to start, just in full disclosure, my top pick and my final pick was McCracken. However, I used Always Dreaming in all A scenarios. The conversation that I was lucky enough to have with some horsemen, I think on Wednesday or Thursday morning on the backside was that, and I think we talked about it on Friday a little bit or Thursday a little bit, was that he'll relax when he's going 47 and change. He doesn't want to relax when he's galloping. He wants to do more. And I that allowed me to get over the hump of the issues that he was having kind of with his behavior in the mornings with not being able to relax. Now, with that said, I thought the performance was good. It wasn't like awe-inspiring. I mean, I guess they ran quickly, and he was one of the pace horses that kind of stuck around. But I think a big theme of what we're going to talk about today, especially, is the way the track was playing. And based on the way the track was playing and the trip that he had, I'm fairly certain that he's going to have to be a play against for me come Preakness, because he found himself on the inside on a track that I think most will agree was favorable to inside speed. And looking at Lee is the same situation. He found himself there as well with one of the best rides I've seen since Calvin Burrell on
it was a carbon copy. Lannery was clearly channeling Burrell in that ride.
Right. So the recap of my answer is good for Always Dreaming. It was a great performance. I didn't have him as much as I needed to have him, but I had him enough to be able to pay my share of the van.
You didn't have to stick Jake with the bill. That's good.
No, and you know, I think he ran well, and God bless him and the connections. I hope he runs well again, but I think my wagering dollar is going to have to lean on someone who had a less advantageous trip than he had.
Well, and speaking of which, I mean, to me, I agree 100%. It seemed bias is always so tricky, and we have a couple of specific listener questions about bias that we'll get to during the course of the show. Maybe I'll even hotshot them up in the order, and we'll talk about them now. But there was no doubt in my mind that inside and speed were where you wanted to be. For especially, I wish I'd done a little more work on this. I'm tempted to say especially in the 2-turn races. I do believe out of the chute sometimes there plays a little bit differently than the 2-turn races. But especially in the 2-turn races, speed and inside's where you wanted to be. And if you look at the horses who overperformed in the Derby versus what could be expected. They were all on the inside in speed. If you look at horses who underperformed, they were all outside. Granted, there were a couple of very gnarly spots of trouble as well that may have affected those outside horses, but you also saw outside horses with, stalking outside Perfect Trip, Irish War Cry running Too Bad to Be Believed, which makes me think that the track might have had something to do with that potentially. But there's one horse that broke this model, Jonathan, and ran extremely well despite closing, despite being outside, and despite a whole lot of trouble in the race. So the question is Classic Empire your Preakness winner?
Yeah, I mean, if they were loading into the gate right now and I was in line and I just had to bet on someone, that's who I would bet on right now. I'm a little bit afraid that he's still going to take more money than I would like for him to take.
Oh, he's going to be
in that
hammered,
situation.
isn't he?
Yeah, because I think that, especially with the worst part about it is that I think he's going to be bet because of the start more than his wide trip, and I think the wide trip is actually the reason why I would want to bet him. And we've talked about that before. When people are betting horses for the reason that you're not, it's kind of frustrating because you're losing that value.
Value's like sand running through your hands, where
Exactly.
People are going to end up where you want to be for the wrong reason. You're giving up equity there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think if I had to sprint to the window now, it would be there. Feels like it's going to be a quick pace just by some of the names I've seen. I saw 3 rules being tossed around. We all know his way of going. I think that Irish War Cry has something to say about what 3 rules can do to a front running type horse. So, it's going to be interesting and see what's going to happen with Classic Empire. But, I think that actually, what's funny is I heard Baffert yesterday on Bick call his shot right now that Classic Empire is going to win. No, I'm sorry. He said, no, he didn't. He said Always Dreaming. He threw me off because he did say Classic Empire had a really bad trip, and he's got that looking at lucky thing about him, and he should run well in the Preakness. But then he confused me later by saying Always Dreaming is going to win, which
we know
Baffert's
bizarre, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think the horse is extremely. I mean, that horse is just so tough to do with everything that Classic Empire's been through. And I just thought ran a race. It's hard to say. I think I have to pull up. I want to say he was best. And based on what we see happens with this bias as these horses run back, and we can really see what Always Dreaming's trip was worth versus what Classic Empire's trip was worth. I think there's a world in which I will eventually say he was best. I really believe that. I know it sounds a little crazy. I can't quite go there yet. I can say I think he was second best right now. And in time, I think you might even be able to upgrade from there. Does that sound nuts to you? I'm talking about a horse here, of course, who was, beating a whole lot of lengths.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I have no problem with a trip note with a horse that ran second saying that he was best. It's hard for me to move a horse up 4 spots based on a trip. I mean, and it's not like he was making up ground on Always Dreaming late. I mean, Always Dreaming galloped out in front and kept going. But I can get on with the idea that he was second best. The real puzzle for me and the real hard one for me that I'm trying to figure out what it means is I understand why Always Dreaming won. I understand why Looking at Lee ran second, and I understand why Classic Empire ran fourth. I can't fully understand what happened with Battle of Midway yet.
I got a theory. I'll share. And this actually was a question that we got. I didn't unfortunately write down who asked it, but somebody asked. I couldn't have Battle of Midway even after the race. What did I miss? I don't think anybody necessarily missed anything, but I do think. I mean, he was forward, he was inside, and he did have. And we did talk about this a little bit. We didn't want horses coming out of the Santa Anita Derby, but if you sort of put a gun to my head and said, "Who do you want coming out of the Santa Anita Derby?" He was the one who was, in my view, there, the sort of flow upgrade, the horse who ran the hardest. So the idea that an improving 3-year-old with the right trip in the Derby could get third and fourth. I'm not saying I bet him. I didn't. But I wouldn't have been averse. I did not play the super in the Derby after all. Even though I kind of liked Sonneteer for the bottom spots, there just weren't enough tosses that I wasn't zeroed in enough on, I like those three horses kind of equally, Always Dreaming, Irish War Cry, and McCracken in the end. And I did not play verticals, but I would have left this horse in for third and fourth, I think. And I think he would have been the only one that I would have done that from the Santa Anita race, if that sways you at all.
No, he's the only one I would have used from the Santa Anita race. It's just, our friend Mike Maloney says there's no trips in slow races. And that was kind of one of the reasons I got off of him. The lesson that I learned with him, and subsequently I learned it in another race that I'm not going to remember which one it is this weekend. But if it's a little bit different when you are in a pace duel of a slow final time race. I think that there's a little bit of an upgrade that needs to be had in those spots because I think we've all agree that's more hard. I think it shows more of the energy that a horse exerts in a situation when they run really hard early, and I think that's what kind of happened with Battle of Midway. I think that figure was low, but there was a hidden good performance in there based on him kind of running out of his style in a 3-horse duel, going entirely too fast. And so I guess that's the lesson that I learned with Battle of Midway. I'm just afraid if they ran the race again, he's the type of horse I probably still wouldn't use. And looking at Lee as one that obviously if I knew he was going to get that trip, I would have used.
Yeah, I couldn't put him in my exacta. I'll give you that. But the idea of just trying to design the race, I could see him hanging around for a little tiny piece. It's not the craziest thing I've ever heard. Let's talk about the disappointing performances from Irish War Cry and McCracken. What, if any, excuses did you see for those two runners since we talked so much about them in the run-up?
Well, so for McCracken, I would think that there's a couple of things. I think that maybe he wasn't as good as we thought he was. He apparently kind of got torn up a little bit in one of his back hind legs. Not sure how significant that is. And then I also heard that Ian Wilkes said, maybe he just doesn't want to run that far. And then obviously the fact that he was wide pretty much the entire race, I think probably took a toll on him as well. Irish War Cry, the same thing. He was wide in that situation. Since I was a little bit more against Irish War Cry than others, I think the crazy part about Irish War Cry was that, are those performances, that he had those easy leads, were they as good as we thought they were? Not easy leads, easy paces that he was chasing, one of them in which he had an easy lead.
Yeah, it's a tough call. And now let's segue into the bias talk. So it's very hard for me to make calls about Irish War Cry and McCracken at this stage. I want to get, and it's going to be hard because it depends. It sounds like they're both going to the bench. So we may have some good data before they come back to help inform these decisions. But if we decide that the inside was really worth something very significant and the outside was a significant disadvantage, especially with the middle move a horse like McCracken made with trouble, Irish War Cry is still a little harder to forgive. But gosh, if you just couldn't be in that part of the track, and that horse has time and is now, from basically today is going to be trained up to the Haskell, which is the race that they've circled on the calendar, I could probably forgive that too, especially if this inside speed bias was confirmed. So let's talk about that bias for a minute. We had 2 questions about it. One came in from Chris, and he wanted to know, Jonathan, when watching race replays and reviewing charts, what do you see when you determine a track is biased?
I think that it's you have to handicap the race first of all and understand which horses are supposed to run well, which ones are supposed to not run well, and then you need to identify if a good horse ran bad or if a bad horse ran good, and then identify if there happens to be some type of correlation between why those two things happened.
And what are you looking for? Are you looking at speed versus closers, or are you looking at inside versus outside?
I'm more of an inside versus outside, because the speed versus closer thing, and a perfect example, which is a good transition we probably need to get to anyways, would be the Kentucky Oaks. Paradise Woods got to the rail and was there the entire time. Abel Tasman closed on the outside, although she did get to the rail on the first turn, then closed on the outside. But the pace was so supersonic fast that it just kind of overcame the idea that it doesn't matter if Abel Tasman was, if Paradise Woods was running on one of those things in the airport, those like conveyor belt things in the airport. She just wasn't going to win after going 46 to the half in the slop. And so
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Right. You have to identify if and when a horse outruns their situation based on where they are. And I think that's probably the hardest part about it, and we've talked, there's a million examples, right? There's probably 5 examples of horses that, in my opinion, moved up because they were there.
That's a great point. Looking at what the horse, and Duke Matisse talked about this in the Winning Contest Player, that one of the ways that he assesses bias after the fact is looking at what, and Mike Maloney does something similar, looking at the figure a horse was supposed to run versus what figure it did run and where they were on the track and how that affected said horse. So in other words, if every horse on the inside is running 5 points lower than what you projected them to run, that's a pretty good indicator that there's something going on. Now let's talk for a second about Paradise Woods. I have my theory is developing on this subject, and what you said makes perfect sense, JK, that it was the pace that was the undoing of Paradise Woods. But I think the track, in my opinion, at this time, the track was pretty similar for the Derby and for the Oaks. And given the fractions Always Dreaming was able to cut out, makes me think that like the A game Paradise Woods, the same Paradise Woods who ran back in the Santa Anita Oaks, that the pace wasn't, I'm not saying the pace helped. It sure didn't. It led to a meltdown. But I don't think the pace alone is an excuse. I think there was something else going on, and I think you can, in my opinion, and you could take your pick between, if you want to use the word bounce, you could throw that in the mix. But for me, even more than that, I think it was just a case of, and we've seen this many times, not all horses who handle the glib Southern California racing surface can then adapt and run on the deeper Churchill Downs racing surface, especially when you throw slop into the mix. So I think there was more something like that going on. And the other reason why is she wasn't even really best of speed. It's not like she's supposed to put that horse away and at the very least get tagged late, a la American Pharaoh and the Travers, not to bring up bad memories. But I mean, this was a horse who was kind of done on the turn and gasping and just not looking like the same animal. So I'm not sure, throw the pace in the mix as one of the factors, but I don't think it's the dominant factor why she lost, especially after seeing the fractions that Always Dreaming was able to cut out and still always be finishing. So what do you think of my theory?
I mean, I get that. Like I said, it's one of those things that we'll get the full answer when a majority of those horses run back. The biggest difference to me comparing the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks is that extra 1/8 of a mile that they have to run in the Derby is an absolute separator. So there could be a lot of closers that were in great position to make runs, but didn't make those runs because it's way too far for them. Horses like Gunnevera, maybe even horses like McCracken, that they weren't picking up pieces in the Derby because ultimately that's too far for them. And so I think that it's a little bit less of a daunting task for the fillies that show up in the 1 1/8 race, especially because majority of the preps for the Kentucky Oaks are at a 1 1/8. So most of the horses that show up there have already shown their ability to get a 1 1/8 and not have to take on that extra 1/8 of a mile. Obviously, it's a lot less traffic to have to overcome as well in the Oaks and the Derby. I get what you're saying. I would have liked to see Paradise Woods put away Miss Sky Warrior, but Miss Sky Warrior was my second choice. Those two fillies were, in my opinion, the best in the race, and they Paco gutted Paradise Woods, and the race was over from there. I mean, it fell apart. Daddy's Little Darling came running late, and I don't remember who ran third. It's like I said, I did have a few lilies, but I think that the difference between the two that we're comparing and why did the Derby not fall apart, I think the Derby was trying to fall apart. But like we talked about before, the horses that are leading at the 8th pole in the Kentucky Derby typically win or typically stay on for good pieces of it. And I think that's the story is that extra 1/8 of a mile is less closer friendly than one might imagine.
It's so interesting. It's kind of a contrarian theory. Well, here's another little bit of data to your point, Jonathan, and it's just looking at the pace figures that Craig Milkowski makes for the Timeform US site. Big difference in pace figures that suggests that it was, in fact, the pace that was at least half the equation. He had Paradise Woods at a 154 as opposed to Always Dreaming 141. So both fast, both are going to be coded red in those races on the Timeform USPPs, but the Paradise Woods situation was all the more damaging.
But here's the thing: it's like Dale Romans has said in the past. I mean, and we talked about it before. Is when you're going 141 on the front end, then the horses that are behind you are going faster than they would like to go as well, which then dulls their late kick. And so it's especially true when you're doing it in a 1.25 mile race, because like I said, these horses don't want to go that far anyways. Not only do they not want to go that far, they're back off of a really fast pace. It's carrying them along that they're not going to be picking horses up. The only horse that was picking horses up, which is Looking at Lee, which I think most people thought he would want to run that far, and he got the best ride in the race.
I mean, that trip was just incredible. Go and watch that tape and just watch how Lannery rides that horse. Lockdown was third. You asked about that before, and yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that Romans theory, but it's predicated on the idea that horses are close enough to get cooked. If the jockey is able to just have their horse running their 12s like they normally do, it's going to be very much advantageous to the closer to have those horses go fast. So it's not always true. It's sometimes true. That's the problem with concepts like pace and bias. You want it to be as simple as 2 + 2 = 4, but there's a lot of other equations that come into it where, it's not like 2 + 2 is ever going to equal 5, but sometimes 3 + 1 = 4 instead of 2 + 2, if you get where I'm saying.
Here's an example. Practical Joke ran he was 7th. He ran a 135 early. His previous race, he ran in the Bluegrass, he ran a 113 early. And then his race before that in the Fountain of Youth, he ran a 105 early. So that was the fastest Practical Joke has ever run early and the longest race he's ever run.
When he doesn't want to go that far.
And that's why his closing kick wasn't there.
Yeah. And that closing kick has come up short before at shorter distances. He's a very interesting horse. What do you? I know we're jumping around now from the Oaks back to Derby, and I feel bad we've given short shrift to the winner, Abel Tasman. But since Practical Joke came up, what do you do if you're those guys with him?
I mean, if I'm them, I cut him back and try to beat Wild Shot in the Woody Stevens.
I was going to say, is there any thought? I mean, maybe this is just crazy, but is there any thought of the Met Mile?
Maybe. I'm trying to think if Chad's going to have anybody. Oh, he'll have Connect, so probably not.
Yeah, probably not for that reason.
And he's a 3-year-old, so what's the point of jumping into those waters now? Let's. There's nothing wrong with winning the Woody Stevens and then trying to win the King's Bishop at Saratoga. And I would assume that Seth Clareman and Clairvich Stables wouldn't have a problem with adding that race to the resume.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was throwing it out there. That race is such a stallion maker. There is a value add to trying a race like the Met Mile, but probably the more conservative path. The King's Bishop's pretty darn important race too.
I will say this about Practical Joke: he continuously outruns what I think he's going to do, and not just me, others as well. He continuously outruns my expectations. I think he might actually be a pretty darn good horse.
I mean, right. If we're right in that this, as good as he's been and as much talent as he showed, has been doing something he doesn't even really want to be doing, that's pretty impressive when we get on the cutback.
And with that said, Joel Rosario probably needs to get the silver medal for the ride of the day in the Derby, finding himself on the rail from the 19 hole when they crossed under the spires for the first time. Pretty impressive.
Not too bad, is it? Let's talk Abel Tasman. This is one of those things where I just feel like such a dork. When we had, after the Santa Anita race, we had the show where we had Matt Bernier on, and Matt was making the point, about, even if Abel Tasman's going to improve, it's an awful lot of lengths to find between Paradise Woods. I apparently made the comment that the difference in racetrack between Santa Anita and Churchill could be half of that alone. Why don't I listen to myself, Jonathan? I didn't have Abel Tasman anywhere. I went fully on board the Paradise Woods bandwagon. And then it's one of those ones after the race where, you'd sort of look back at your race design and the idea that Paco would ride exactly like he did, making it all the tougher on Paradise Woods. Were we wrong to sleep on Abel Tasman?
Well, I think what happens in this situation, at least for me, is that and I think we had a question about this too, about how do you identify a bias within a day and then execute upon that knowledge that you've gained. And I mean, that's why I fell even further in love with Paradise Woods. I projected she was going to get to the rail, and I just thought she wouldn't look back. The thing about it with Abel Tasman is that I just didn't see a trip in which she was going to get a rail position from the 13 hole against those horses, that's just that's one of the most difficult things is how that's going to all unfold and what's going to happen when the entire jocks room realizes that there is a bias and then they dead send out of there because they think speed is good. It sets it up for horses like that. I mean, I share your sentiment. I feel silly not having a little bit of Abel Tasman, considering what we had talked about in the past on how we thought there was going to be a move up with the trainer change, just based on Baffert and what Baffert does. I don't have to really apologize for that. He won the Kentucky Oaks with the Phillies, so he's proving that point to be true. And so, it just happens. It's just sometimes you look up, and when I saw the GIF of Bob and Bodie dabbing on Twitter the next morning, I felt like a real idiot for not having that horse in some capacity.
Well, you and I had both put forth variations on the theory that maybe, that the closing running style didn't suit the Baffert program and all this sort of narrative stuff that obviously was just a bunch of hogwash. So we kind of have to eat it as far as that goes. Any other thoughts coming out of the Oaks? Anybody else you're in a hurry to bet back out of there?
I'm in a hurry for Daddy's Little Darling to get onto the turf again. If I'm not mistaken, she is a half to Mongolian Saturday, who was the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint winner. And so I'm assuming she's a Scat Daddy as well with the Daddy's Little Darling. So there's a lot of turf in there. So I'd like to see that at some point in the near future. And I'm a little bit less than excited about how much we're probably going to see Paradise Woods the rest of the year. I mean, what are they going to do with her? I mean, are they should keep her on the West Coast? I mean, I feel like Mandela is probably going to, honestly, he might not ever get on a plane again. With some of the favorites that have gotten beat when he's shipped. I think it's completely circumstantial. I don't think it has anything to do with his ability.
You're referring to Beholder was a horse but in Beholder's case, she was famously just not a good actor when she shipped, right? Like she
ran really well in the Oaks as well. So. Anyway, it was just a semi joke. I mean, nothing.
No, but you're joking. But if you're Mandela, when you have a whole program of races out there, why would you stretch and think about shipping Paradise Woods to more ambitious spots at this point? I think you'd be more likely to stay home. I mean, it's a fun little division that's shaping up out there.
Yeah, I mean, the crazy part about it is that I think the Acorn is going to be a really cool race. I think that, what Benner Island did in the 8 Bells, obviously she'll stretch out to a mile. I think that'll be interesting. I mean, I'm looking forward to, how cool would it be if Miss Sky Warrior were to cut back in the Acorn? Like I said, I doubt we'll see Paradise Woods in the Acorn, but how exciting would that be? So, there'll be some good races for those fillies moving forward, and I'll definitely be looking forward to seeing them run.
Let's talk a little bit more about this issue of bias. It obviously played a part not just in the Oaks and Derby, but in all the races run. And let's get back to Robert's question about how hard it is to capitalize on these biases. You're seeing them in real time, but the jockeys are going to start sending. The jockeys are going to relate to the bias. What are some things you can do? How do you react as a horse player on a day when you see this bias in effect. Some guys make their whole career off trying to take advantage of this stuff in real time. Other players, and I think you and I are both in this number, Jonathan, we try to factor it into our race design. We try to use it to our advantage, but some seems there's plenty of times where just something that we don't anticipate happens, and it makes things very difficult.
The tricky part about it is you have to be really good at race design, and you have to be prepared for what situations can happen. We talked on Friday where the one of the biggest misses that I had of the weekend, because I was doing well on the the pick six on Friday, was in that race where the 5-horse won after in the allowance race, Task for Glory. How do you predict that horse is going to get to the rail? And that's the hardest part when you're designing races is who's going to go, who are the jockeys, are they going to send, are those spots going to get vacated? Is this rider and horse going to tuck in? And those are the things you have to try to figure out. And it's not easy, but it's to me, the answer to that question is how do you design your races and how do you design the potential ways that a race can unfold? And that typically can help you. And here's this is not me banging on my chest. I have lost so much money on Birdsong. I was convinced the horse wants to run shorter. And the only reason I used Birdsong is because I just felt like he was going to get to the rail. And he did.
Makes sense.
And to me, that's the only reason he won. And if you look at the first, second, and third place finishers of the Ali Sheba, they all spent a significant amount of time on the rail.
I think that two things that really matter on these kind of days when you notice it happening in real time, much more so than normally, and it factors into race design, but to even break your race design down to its component parts, you're looking at post position. You're looking at the normal sort of elements of race design with pace figures, who's got the speed early to get where, knowing your riders, unbelievably important. Corey Lannery, the whole 2 days, demonstrated that he understood what was going on in that track. And if you did that exercise we talked about before, what figure are you going to project the horse to run versus what figure did the horse run? Corey Lannery would have a big plus with perhaps a double-digit number next to his name for how well he was riding. So I think those are the kind of things you can look at. What we'll do, and we're not going to do this until his book is available for pre-sale, but at some point we'll do an hour with Mike Maloney on this topic, because he's in that number I'm referring to who've taken this skill and just ran with it. And I still haven't talked to him about how he did with this bias on Oaks and Derby Day, but that'll be a really interesting conversation that I think we need to have. You also, JK, made a cool observation in that conversation we had on Friday. You said something like, I don't like betting on bias, I like betting out of bias. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think it's easier. It's like I like getting up at 9:00 more than I like getting up at 7. I mean, I can still do it. I just prefer the other one. It's just easier to bet out of.
Explain what you mean by the concept of it.
Okay, so if I know that a horse was if I know that there was a bias on Derby Day and looking at Lee got the best of the bias with the best ride like we talked about, I like the idea of betting against him or tossing him in the Preakness on a fair track. To me, that's easier than identifying a track that is biased and then finding out which horses are going to get to the bias and which horses are going to win from the bias. Because it's more of a leap of faith, in my opinion, where you are going to pick a horse that you would not normally pick on a fair track because of where you think the horse is going to get in terms of geography on the racetrack. That's a lot harder to do. And so I prefer to do it the other way, where I'm going to have a field day betting horses and fading horses out of Derby and Oaks Day. I'm not saying I'm going to be right, but I'm saying I'm going to have a field day with it. The other tricky part about it is to keep in mind, it makes it a little bit more difficult, though, is that the surface was sloppy, right? So did a horse actually, did a horse that was outside, did that horse move up because of the slop? Like Classic Empire, for instance. I'm not saying this would happen, but just play this game in your head. Did Classic Empire really run that good on the outside of a biased track? Or did Classic Empire absolutely love the slop? Like, now what do you do, right? Because why did he actually run so well? And so that's where it can be a little bit tricky. But I prefer to bet out of a bias rather than on one in the moment.
It's definitely an easier game. I liked your waking up in the morning analogy there. That was perfect. Let's get to some listener questions, and then we're going to wrap the show with a little tournament talk. Maybe we'll go more into the undercard races on both days. We'll touch on some of it in these questions, and the rest of them we'll get to a little bit later in the week. We had a question about how your superfecta box in the Derby worked out.
Terrible. Yeah, terrible. I mean, it wasn't good at all. I can go on for days about how many. I mean, I didn't have second, third, or fourth.
So bit of a whiff on that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything you felt, any mistakes you felt you made, or was that one of those where you're just so far off that you don't second guess it, you just move on?
Yeah, there was some mistakes definitely that were made. I should have. Well, here's one thing. I was never going to hit it because I was always tossed in Classic Empire. So there's really nothing I could have done differently. In hindsight, I probably should have had a little bit of looking at Lee, considering that he was down on the inside and he had Corey Landry. That was a mistake. Should have had him. Was never probably going to have Battle of Midway. I did have some of the horses that ran behind that I thought kind of outran their, what people thought they were going to do. I had Taprit. And like I said, I mean, I was completely off. I didn't have Guinevere. And I had a lot of horses that didn't run well. IRAP, Sonneteer, Hints, Irish Warcry. So I had a lot of horses that were in the back half of the field. And then obviously I used Thunder Snow, who one of my favorite tweets of the weekend was Thunder Snow's fifth dam was a kangaroo,
I wish you could give credit for that one. That's pretty funny.
Which is a little bit mean, but very unfortunate.
All I'm going to ask you,
okay, right? So he's fine.
Oh yeah. We wouldn't be laughing about it if there was something wrong with the horse. Physically, we think it was just. I'll just ask, what the hell was that?
The saddle slipped. I heard it slipped around an area that you could kind of understand the uncomfort.
You'd be bucking and kicking too. Is that what you're saying, JK?
That's what I had heard. But you know what I want to know? I want to know if the person who saddled him is still employed. So if someone can let me know if that's the case. I'm curious about that.
Don't wish ill of anybody's employment chances, but that was a debacle and a half. Got a question about how you approached the multi-race wagers on Derby Day. This one was specifically about you, but I'll just chime in. If Good Samaritan wins, I get it all. I might not even be here today. I might be on a desert island retired. But that aside, the question was directed to you. How did you approach the multis?
I played a kind of a caveman situation on Friday with a group. We went 4 of 6, missing. We singled Paradise Woods. We missed there, and then obviously that 5 horse that we had mentioned earlier that ran in the allowance race that went up the rail. And then on Saturday we did another group ticket, and we singled Roca Rojo, who we were fortunate enough to get home. Then we caught Wild Shot, and we used. We did not use Arklow. We used the second, third, and fourth place finishers of that race, and then we hit the rest of the way and got 5 of 6, and actually doubled our money with the 5 of 6 with all of the conso. So that worked out. When you're alive for a big score like that, and you can make a little bit of money, that's always a positive situation. And then the one that I really made the most money on was the pick 3, starting with Limousine Liberal, Decidero, and Always Dreaming.
Here's your chance to crow a little bit. And this actually factors into another question we got in, and it'll segue nicely into our tournament talk. Somebody texted me privately that when he saw Limousine Liberal, Decidero, and Always Dreaming, he just assumed you won the Kentucky Derby betting challenge.
Yeah, well, that money was gone on Friday, so there was none to be had for that.
If you had bankroll, think about this honestly. I'm putting you on the spot, but I don't care. If you had bankroll, even just your initial bankroll, with those three horses, all of whom you touted on out of the gate, all of whom you touted, I mean, like you've touted Divisadero to the point on the podcast where we got a question, will JK name his next child Divisadero? And then, of course, Always Dreaming, your first round Derby pick, Derby draft pick, even though not your official Derby selection. Is it reasonable to think you could have gone pretty close?
It's reasonable. The problem is that, if I'm being honest, I'm thinking about so many other horses I would have bet earlier in the day that I just don't even know if I still would have had any bankroll. But, I mean, you could play doubles, so there's a very legitimate opportunity that I would have had a Limousine Liberal Divisadero double. And then I think that it's pretty obvious that I could have had a Divisadero Always Dreaming double. So, I mean, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, if I would have had, if things would have gone better on Friday, and I would have had $17, $18, $16, $20,000, then yeah, I think I would have been really dangerous in those last three races, because I think I would have hit a lot of them. But the problem is, I would have lost a lot of money on the Derby Exacta, because I would not have had Looking at Lee. So that would have been trouble. I wouldn't have hit the try in race 10, which Limousine Liberal won, because I didn't like Tom's Ready for third. So there's a lot of reasons that it could have all gone wrong, if I'm being completely honest. But hitting them on the head kind of helped. The worst part about it is that I started at pick 5 with Limousine Liberal, the Divisadero, Always Dreaming. Then I had the Visionary Tale, who was, I don't remember what the price he was, the 2 horse that won the 13th. And then I was single to Super Wish for a $3 pick 5. And that was coming back $6,800 for $1. And I was single to the even money shot in the last for what was about $20,000. So that was a little bit frustrating, but worked out.
I kept it simple, bailed out on what was shaping up to be a very difficult weekend with that pick 3 that you mentioned, and then just sort of kept my money in my pocket. I figured I felt lucky to get out with the Limousine Liberal Divisadero Always Dreaming pick 3, which I thought paid a pretty decent price, and that was enough for me. I wasn't hardcore enough to be playing the 13th and 14th like you, Jonathan, but it does make me wonder, like, if you're looking at the 2 days beforehand, are you identifying ahead of time that your three of your stronger opinions are going to be Limousine Liberal, Divisadero, and Always Dreaming? And if you are, isn't there a logic to try to at least save some scratch to try to get down and crush those races?
Hindsight's 2020. My best opinions were Paid Up Subscriber, American Freedom, and Paradise Woods. Those were my
You felt stronger about those going in on Friday than you did those 3 on Saturday. Then you played it exactly right.
Absolutely. And the way the track was playing, I'll be honest, I used in all situations, but I didn't love Limousine Liberal from the 9 hole in that situation where, you knew Masochistic was going to get to the rail, and you knew that other horses would be forwardly placed. Like, I didn't at all. It wasn't a strong situation. I mean, Divisadero, I was strong on Divisadero, but I mean, at the half-mile pole, I would have traded in my Divisadero ticket.
And we talked about bias on the dirt. We didn't even talk about the bias on the turf course, which seemed like certainly the jockeys believed halfway through the day on Saturday that the inside was not where you wanted to be on the turf. Avoiding
Rojo's race is the best example of what you're talking about.
Oh, it's unreal. Watch the head-on of that race. The leaders in the 4-path?
Yeah, they stayed off the rail completely the entire time. Now, but later in the day, they kind of got a little bit less, less aware of that, But they were, Oscar nominated. Oscar nominated, excuse me. I mean, that horse was wide. I mean, that horse was in the 6th path and ran on for 3rd against Grade 1 horses. So, I think it's clearly there is something to be said about the inside not being great. You can even look back to Friday with Green Mask winning from the 12 hole and Dream Dancing and La Cornell, although they were the 1 and the 1A, they broke from like the 9 and the 10 or 9 and the 11, the 8 and the 11, something they broke from the outside. So I do think there's something to that as well that people should keep an eye on moving forward.
Definitely the best horses in the race there, but with the absolute ease of victory and the underperformance of some of the horses, again, running on the inside, including Jake's filly, who you mentioned before. the ground might have been part of the reason why we didn't see her to her best effect on that day. Boy, there's so much more to talk about, and only 5 minutes left. Let's keep it to tournaments, since we're talking about. We did a good deconstruction of your KDBC and determined you did nothing wrong and just weren't right in the right spots. The overall winner, Kevin McFarland, did plenty right. Ends up getting there with a $9,000 win bet on Always Dreaming in the Kentucky Derby and played it. He did a very interesting thing that I think is something that more big players should consider doing, which is he was basically playing the Derby Day races the way he was going to anyway, but he was betting at such a level where he might as well do it in the context of the contest and get the extra equity available in the form of the prize pool. So he and his betting partner, Nissan Gabe, were looking at that race, and they thought they saw an opportunity to, playing it the way they wanted to play it, make $100,000 if they're with the amount they were willing to invest, which turned out to be about $27,000 versus what the exactas were coming back with their long shots. They realized, of course, it's a lot harder to hit an exacta than it is to hit a win bet. So they divided up the bankroll in such a way where they'd win $50,000 if Always Dreaming won, and give them still a chance at the contest. And then if they were right, they'd have a chance to truly crush it. They end up not crushing it. They don't have the exacta. They don't have anything for the exacta and try. But I thought it was sort of a clever way to approach the last race to still get to a number on their strongest opinion that could get them into the winner's circle of the KDBC. What do you think of that strategy, Jonathan?
No, it's great. I mean, that's what you want to do. You want to have money around late to bet your opinion, to not be forced to do something you don't want to do. You just get to bet what you like, and if you're right, you win. They turned a 9-2 shot into, I don't know.
You got an extra I don't know.
28 to 1 shot, is that right?
Yeah, they got an extra, I think, like $220,000 from the prize pool.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they turned the favorite in the Derby to about 30 to 1, which is pretty impressive. So good for them. Congratulations.
Yeah, hats off. That I should probably put that line in my article. I'm not going to give you a byline, though, JK, just so you know right now. I'm stealing that one for myself.
It's all good.
Not the only contest going on this weekend. We had the first Grade 1 qualifier for the World Championship of Handicapping. Did you participate in that, or were you too busy running around like a nut?
Oh, too busy running around like a nut. I participated in spirit. Elliot Honecker, who got his seat, texted me and said that he didn't really know what to do in the sprint, and he used Limousine Liberal because he heard me talk about it on the pod. So that makes me feel good.
That's awesome. Now, he
still owes me. That's twice now, because he beat me out of a $12,000 score to the greatest Triple Crown winner of our lifetime and American Pharaoh with Keen Ice as part owner of that horse. And then now I've given him a little boost into the World Championship of Handicapping. So I'm going to check. FedEx should be sending something sooner than later. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but maybe he doesn't have my right address.
Oh my God, that's amazing. And I'm not 100% sure, but as a Donegal Racing owner, he might own a piece of Arklow, who he also used in the contest. I'll be catching up with Elliot for a piece on DRF.com later this week. The other qualifiers for the WCH, Gerald Siegel, overall winner, William Casper, Rick Broth, a familiar name to many tournament players, and then our buddy Kevin Costello, friend of the podcast, and then another friend of the podcast, Elliot Honecker, rounding out those top five. So WCH off to a big start. If you've somehow been living in a cave and have missed it, this is a $1 million no takeout finals. You can qualify any day, start your journey to qualify any day on tournaments.drf.com for as little as $11, or you can play in what's proving to be very popular $95 round one events, where you finish in the top 1 in 7 entries will advance to the round 2, where it's 1 in 10 who get their full $5,000 seats, or you can just buy your way straight in to that $580 round 2 event. About a minute left. Just want to give props. We also had our contest last week. We had a really great response. A lot of listeners chiming in. We're going to be doing more of these contests in the future. I don't have one lined up for today, but we had 2 players, Alex and Adam, who picked the correct cold double. I did a random drawing with the help of Perrin. Alex Goggin gets the nod. He wins the $95 round one entry, but we don't want Adam to feel too bad, so we're going to send him 2 of the $11 feeder entries so he can start his journey as well, hopefully win his way into the $95 round one. So then we'll have 2 podcast listener success stories. I'll be emailing each of you gentlemen with the details coming up. Jonathan, that's about all the time we have. A quick closing thought for this Derby recap podcast.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard anything you said for the last minute and a half. If Elliot owns part of Arklow, our friendship is officially over.
Oh my goodness, Jonathan, you're you have your own. It's sort of good, like the people, superheroes have their sort of arch rivals. We may now have it down where we know who your arch rival is, and it may be Elliot Honecker. We'll get the details. It'll be up on DRF.com later in the week. Don't take it too personal, though.
He just texted me. The friendship's over. He owns part. It's over.
Amazing stuff. Congratulations to Elliot. What a Derby day he had. And that's all the time we have. I want to thank Jonathan Kinchin. I want to thank Craig, as always, for pushing all the right buttons. I want to thank everybody out there for listening. Most of all, we're going to be back on Friday, probably still looking a little bit backward to an amazing weekend of racing. Also maybe looking a little bit forward to a host of races, including the Beaugay. Thanks again, everybody. We'll be back Friday. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatal. May you win all your photos.